I've had this diesel heater for a few weeks now, and the advantages over propane are huge. With this, you get really hot, dry air coming into the tent, none of the condensation you have from propane, and it is a lot safer. There's no open flame inside your tent, so no risk of anything falling over and starting fires, and there's no risk of carbon monoxide because it uses a heat exchanger. Now, the build that I did a few weeks ago was kind of a budget build. $150, and I had something that worked. It was done. It was definitely not perfect, and it didn't have any fancy features to it. I had a ton of feedback from that video and loads of great suggestions. So what I wanted to do is take it out and start again and put some of those suggestions to use. So where my last one cost under $150, this one with all of the equipment I've got so far is around $300. I'll link a full parts list for everything I used in this video in the description, and I'll have it at revereoverland.com/diesel. So with my last design, I had just the heater and the fuel pump inside the box and everything else was outside. With this one, I want a more self-contained setup, and I want something that's gonna be portable and I could use to heat an awning room, for example, when I'm cooking dinner. So inside this box, I plan on having this on the roof rack with it opening towards the tent. So this would be the front of the vehicle, this would be towards the back. I'm gonna have the diesel heater sitting in here this way around. So I've got the hot air and the exhaust on that side because my tent opens on this side. And then on the cold air side, I plan on sticking the fuel tank in. With my old setup, everything was kind of external and it pulled fresh air into the box itself as an intake for the heater. Whereas with this one, I'm gonna have an air intake on the front and an output on the back. So I need a way to actually keep the box itself cool. So I'm gonna use these little 3-inch vents, and the plan is to have them on the bottom on this end and then on the top at the far end. This is the cool side of the heater. This is where the air is pulled in on this side, and then on this side, that's where your heat, your hot air goes out, and you've got the exhaust on that end. So what I think will happen, what I hope will happen, is that any warm air that's in here will rise to the top and it will go out the top vents over here, and that will pull cool air in on this side. So you'll kind of have an airflow going across. It's kind of how a chimney works. That's the theory. Whether or not it'll work in practice, I don't know. We'll find out. I measured the 3-inch holes to make sure there'd be no overlap with the lip inside the box. The hole saw cut fairly easily through the soft aluminium, or aluminum for the Americans. When you put the vents in, don't hit them like I did, you'll bend them. So I still have 2 more 3-inch holes to drill on the front somewhere here, because I'm going to put in a blast gate like this. That's where the hot air out and the fresh air in are going to go, because I want to be able to shut it off from the elements while I'm driving along. So I don't know exactly where those are going to go, because I need to really set up the heater on its mount. So the heater's going to go inside here, but it sits on this. This is its mount, and I'm going to suspend the mount on some little L brackets, so it's up in the air a little bit. Technically you can mount the heater on its side as long as the glow plug is up, the glow plug's pointing down and it's on the top. You can mount it on its side, but it's just better all around to have it so the exhaust comes out at the bottom. It helps with drainage of condensation and any unburnt fuel. So what I'm going to have to do with this blast gate is, and unfortunately the way it's designed, it has the slide of the actual gate goes down the inside of these 2 pieces. So I'm not able to put the inside or one side on the inside. Both are going to have to sit on the outside. Luckily, the way it works is this side is smooth, and then this side is threaded. So I can just put this in here, run, I've got some longer screws. So I will run these through from the inside. They will stick out a little bit on the outside, so they won't look great, but they will hold it in place from the inside. So now I've just got 2 more big holes to drill, and those are going to be for the combustion unit. I've got to have one for the air intake and one for the exhaust. Now with the air intake, the tube that it comes with, I've got it down here, it's not ideal, and I've heard that you actually would be better off going with something larger than this to allow better airflow in, but this is all I've got right now. With the kit, you do get this on the end, and this is actually supposed to just be a kind of muffler to make it quieter, but it makes things worse. So I'm going to take it off, and on the end, I'm just going to do a really short section that'll come out right underneath where the heater is, about here. And I've got this little coupler I picked up from Lowe's. Ideally, you really need to have an air filter on the end. I don't have one yet, but since I got a little PVC pipe here, it should be pretty easy to add one afterwards. With the exhaust pipe, I'm going to have that come out the far end here, and I'm going to have that come out as low as possible. You want your exhaust pipe, if it's in a self-contained unit like this, you want it to go gently down, sloping down with no kinks that are lower, otherwise you'll have liquids build up in those kinks. The way I had mine before, with any lower parts, I just need to drill a hole in them so that any liquids or any condensation can just drip out the bottom. Before I finish up and put the whole thing together, I need to sort out the fuel system. To hold the fuel can down, I'm going with 2 of these little tie downs, and I'm going to strap it down with just one of these straps. I'll put it in, I'll cut this to length, and then I will sort out where the fuel line's running. So the fuel line, the best thing to use is this 2mm fuel line, and then they provide the 3/16 rubber hose to have connections. Now in my last build I ended up using just this because I didn't want a bunch of connections outside of the box, but with this one, because everything's self-contained, I am going to stick with this, and this is much better for the way the fuel pump operates. When you set it up, you want to go from the fuel tank to the fuel filter, and then from there you want the fuel pump mounted as close to the fuel tank as possible. You want the fuel pump angled up around 45 degrees so that fuel flow is going up as it goes through it, and then ideally you don't have many kinks or curves before you get to the fuel inlet on the heater itself. When you mount the fuel pump, it does have this rubber isolating mount, which does help reduce some of the noise. This thing will tap when it pumps. I've heard that the best thing you can do is actually just zip tie it up so it's hanging. I don't really have anywhere to zip tie this from, so I am going to hard mount it on the side here. It is possible that when you run the bolt through, if you do a similar thing to what I've got here, you could put more isolating material between the rubber mount and the outside of this toolbox. When you use this as a connection between 2 things, you want to make sure that you push the clear hose as far down into it as possible so that inside the 3/16 fuel line, that clear hose is pretty much contacting or is contacting whatever you're connecting it to. Also, when you cut this stuff, you want to make sure that you're using a nice sharp utility knife. That way you don't pinch the end. I used an exhaust header wrap to reduce the heat inside the box. While you're installing it, make sure you wear gloves. While trying to insert the heater into the box, I ran into my first major problem. The measurements hadn't accounted for the mount to be wider than the heater itself, so the fuel tank and the heater did not fit side by side. Alright, problem solved. All I had to do was just take everything apart again, pull this base plate off, and just trim it. So now the fuel tank will sit alongside it. However, this little tab in here that will hold the fuel tank down won't fit there. I am going to have to remove that, and I'm going to put it up on the side here. So I'm going to be left with a couple of holes at the bottom. In my previous setup, I had a hot mess of wires that were just sitting inside the box, and then when I got to camp and I wanted to set it up, I had to pretty much every time untangle these and pull them out and feed them through into the tent. So what I plan on doing is cutting. I'm going to make a cut for the controller and then a cut for the, you see it's already tangled up, for the 12 volt input. And I'm going to put all of those, just dump that on the floor. I'm going to put all of those into one waterproof plug, one waterproof connection. So I'll just unscrew it. You can see I have this side is going to go in the box probably about there, and then I'll run the wires through to the control unit here, and then the other one goes to the pump over there. And then this side will have the wires that go into the tent, and I'll try and keep it all nice and clean and organized. I'll put a link to this with the rest of the parts. While soldering, I made a pretty stupid mistake. I soldered the wires into the plug without running them through the hole in the box or through the back of the plug first. I ended up having to cut them, run them where they needed to go, and then re-soldered them, and I did all of that off camera. So this is it. After 2 days and more silly mistakes than I'd like to admit, I am finally done. Before I take this outside and test it out, I just want to show you around so you can take a look at some of the close-ups. So on the front here, I have the waterproof plug. This is where both the power cable and the controllers plug in, both at the same time. So I'll plug that in, screw it in. I also have the 4 vents that I put on at the start. Now these are kind of loose in there. They won't come out, but they are loose, so I'm probably going to silicone around them, maybe glue them in somehow. Inside, I've got some extra storage, and those, and that storage is going to be for the ductwork that I have. So the hot air is on this end. I can just unscrew this, open the blast gate, screw it up, and I can attach the hot air duct. I bought myself some of these clamps with the thumb screw on it, that way it's easy to connect and disconnect. I also have the option to have a return air duct that I can put on this end, so I can loosen this. I need to open this anyway, but I have the option of now putting this into the tent as well. That way, on the coldest of nights, this will be a little more efficient. Inside the box is all very simple, so I've got the heater that is clamped up onto its stand. Underneath it, I've got the exhaust that comes out and goes straight out the side, wrapped in exhaust wrap. There's also the combustion air comes in the back here. I do need to put a filter on this still, I don't have one right now. You've got cold air in, hot air out. Fuel tank is strapped down and pretty secure now. I don't think that's going anywhere. And then the fuel pump with it angled up at 45 degrees. So let's take this out and see how it does. So we're out on Kentucky Adventure Tour testing this out. Andreas, that's his tent behind me, managed to get it soaking wet. So we've hooked up the heater just to his tent for now and we're running it on full blast. And you can probably hear it's not too loud. You can kind of hear it sounds like a fan. I'll be quiet for a second. Then you can just make out the sound of the fuel pump in there tapping. It's not nearly as bad in this metal box as it was in the plastic box. In terms of temperature, we got the ambient temperature is about 40 degrees, and then inside his tent it's at 70. And it's been going for a while, so it's drying out nicely in there. Plan for tonight is to unhook it. I've got a little T-connector. We're going to have one duct going to his tent and one duct going to my tent, so we'll try and warm both of them tonight with the one heater. We'll see how it does, and I'll let you know in the morning. Alright, so it wasn't too bad last night. It was about 30 degrees overnight, and in Andreas's tent, he was nice and toasty. he didn't even have to use his sleeping bag, or he did, but he had it unzipped down the side, nothing else covering him, and that's because he's got a very short duct that goes into his tent. My tent was a little colder. Again, it wasn't really bad. It was actually quite comfortable, about 50 degrees in there. So I was in the sleeping bag, but I was plenty warm enough. I am obviously losing quite a lot of heat to this ductwork as well. So I had this on high all night. The Jackery couldn't handle it on high. I got most of the night on high with the Jackery, but I had to switch over to Andreas' second battery. If it were on low, it would have been just fine. I could run easily with the Jackery 240. I'm getting a Jackery 500, so we'll switch that in, and I'm sure that will do just fine all night running this on high. So the only thing left to do is check out how much fuel it used last night. It was on high, so on maximum pretty much all night, including a couple of hours that we had it running to dry out Andreas' tent. Now when I started, it was about an inch from the top, so about here. So all night heating on maximum, we dropped down to, what's that, about, it's over a third of a tank. Over here. It's probably used about half of what was in there in one night. So it's pretty efficient. Having had the opportunity to take this out and use it for several nights consecutively, I've got a few more things and a few modifications that I made that I want to talk about. We'll start off talking about the power draw. So when you first start this up, it does have a high power draw, around 8-ish amps, just as the glow plug heats up. But once the glow plug's heated up and you've got this thing just burning steadily, it drops down on low to about 0.5 amp to 1 amp. And if you've got something like the Jackery 240 like I have, it will easily last all night. This thing also barely sips the diesel when it's on low. You could easily run this thing, I've got about a gallon or just over a gallon tank in here. You could easily run it for about 3 nights on low. When you're heating on high, the electricity usage is not quite as efficient because it has that fan running on full blast, and it pulls around 3 amps roughly. With the Jackery 240 that I have, it lasted until 5 a.m. on high, and I had to switch out to the battery in Andreas' Tacoma. Like I said though in the video, I'm getting myself a Jackery 500, and Jackery 500 will easily run this thing on high for a couple of nights. After running this thing on high all night, I had used about half a tank, and that included the 2 hours where I ran it heating Andreas' tent to dry it out. So I mean, if you are just heating your tent and the time you're sleeping in it, it will easily last 2 nights on high. In the video clip that I shared with you, you saw that it wasn't really effective at heating both the tents at the same time, and there's a couple of reasons for that, or at least a couple of ways you can fix that. One of them is to have a more efficient duct setup. So the next night we went out, it was closer to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, or around just over -10 degrees Celsius. And we parked a little closer, we set up shorter ducts, and ended up, even though it was colder, we ended up being able to heat the tent to about the same amount. The other thing we did is we set up a return air duct from Andreas' tent. That way it was just reheating what had already been warmed, and it wasn't pulling the coldest air from outside. That helped a little bit, and there weren't any condensation issues. Although if you were just heating one small tent with a couple of people in there, I'd be a little careful of adding to the humidity. Another thing to consider if you're heating a larger space like an awning room or a couple of tents like I was, is getting a more powerful heater. The one I've got in here is just 3 kilowatt, which is plenty if you're just heating one tent. But if you're going to heat a couple of tents, maybe look at the 5 or the 8 kilowatt version. And I'll actually put a link to the 5 kilowatt version because it is cheaper than the one I bought. I actually tested this out in my awning room as well, and ended up heating it to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius over ambient temperature. And it's quite a large space in the awning room, and there was a lot of wind that day. So it did okay, but again, if you're doing a large space like that, consider a bigger heater. If you're just heating the one tent with the heater nice and close to the tent, there's no reason to get anything more than the 3 or the 5 kilowatt version, because even the 3 kilowatt version by itself is plenty. As you saw when we were drying out Andreas' tent, we had this thing on high and it was 70 degrees in there, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. And if you're out camping in the winter, you don't need it to be that hot inside the tent. You want to have taken a decent winter sleeping bag with you. In fact, the only reason I have this is just kind of take the edge off the coldest nights, help encourage my wife to go camping with me. Even at 50 degrees, when I got up the next morning, it was plenty warm enough in there. I found that getting up and getting dressed the next morning was a lot more pleasant, even at 50 degrees when this heater was running. I did make another couple of modifications to this after I finished rolling the camera the other day, and they all involved using this silicone sealant, and this stuff's good for up to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's not an issue with this heater. First of all, I mentioned the vents. They were rattling around, so I put silicone around the vents to hold them in place. And then I did find there was an issue with these blast gates. They're actually really leaky, so I end up, on the hot air one, I end up losing a ton of hot air out of it. So I sealed up the outsides along the top, down the side of the back there, to stop most of the hot air coming out, but obviously where the gate is itself, I'm still losing a lot of hot air. Like I said, this heater setup isn't perfect. Even for me, it's not perfect, and when you build your own, or if you end up building your own, there are definitely things that you can do to make it more suitable for you. There are a couple of problems with this box. One of them is I really don't like having this locking mechanism on here. There's no way to latch it shut without locking it, so that's just another key to keep up with, and if I want to open this in the night, or if I want to do anything with it, I have to unlock it. I have to get my key and unlock it. Another issue is that the lid itself isn't a particularly good fit, and it does rattle pretty bad. Now I plan on solving that. I'm going to put a little rubber lip along the top here underneath the lid, and that should stop that from happening. Another thing is the fuel tank. So I really wanted to get a fuel tank that would fit inside this box and it'd all be self-contained. And the trade-off with that is it's not particularly large. I'm looking at, on high, about 2 days worth of fuel, and on low, about 3-ish days of fuel, which if you're going to be gone for a long time in the winter, that's not enough. You know, I'm going to have to visit a gas station that has diesel several times a week. Now I did order myself another tank here. I don't think it will fit in there, and even if it would fit, it would be on the hot side, which I'm not a fan of having. So I don't know if I'll end up using this, and I don't know how I would set it up for use with multiple fuel tanks anyway. If you do end up using one of these fuel tanks, do be careful when filling it up. You do want to leave about an inch gap at the top. I used this for several days, and I left that gap there and had no problems at all. And then one day I decided I was going to see how full I could get it, how much I could put in there, and it ended up leaking. So I think changes in temperature, maybe changes in altitude, resulted in it leaking when it was extra full, like right up to the top. So don't do that. Diesel stinks. Of course, whatever you end up doing, you can add whatever fuel tank works best for you. Before making this, I did think about using rivets in all of my attachments, but I wanted to do something that I could undo if I made a mistake, and actually ended up having to undo a couple of things. So you could do rivets. It's going to be stronger, more permanent, but the screws that I've used have worked just fine. Finally, if you're looking to do something like this yourself, definitely check out John McKay 47 on YouTube. He is extremely knowledgeable when it comes to diesel heaters, and I watched pretty much all of his videos before creating this one, and I learned a ton. If all of this sounds like too much effort to you, they also make pre-made heaters, so you don't have to mount anything in a box like this. And there's a couple of designs. I'll put a link to both of them in the description, so check that out. I'll also have a link to my full parts list, and you can just go straight there by going to revereoverland.com/diesel. If you found this video useful, make sure you give it a thumbs up. That really helps me out. If you have any questions or suggestions, or if you do anything different, make sure you drop that in the comments. And if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to the channel.